years. We have a hierarchy of needs. You need to feel secure and not at threat of violence against you in order for you to develop yourself, in order to study. We know that kids who get bullied in schools can't study, they can't get their work done, they're living in a state of fear. And that as you get more secure and you feel good about who you are as a person and you feel like you're on the right track, then you start pursuing what he called these higher needs, things like creativity, problem solving. You bring a lack of prejudice, and you are also very willing to confront hard facts. You're so secure in who you are that you can actually rethink the story you tell about yourself and your world. And as societies get wealthier, more and more people rise up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can see this is what's happened in the United States. Life expectancy in the 30s was just under 60 years old. Today it's almost 80. Home ownership obviously increased massively. Private motor vehicle ownership increasing incredibly. Air conditioning going way up. Americans become the richest people this planet has ever seen in the period after World War II. And they start to care about things like the environment, and they also start to care about things like other people. And so we see the civil rights movement emerge. And where does it first emerge from? I think the story we like to tell ourselves is that the most oppressed people rose up and constituted the civil rights movement. In fact, it emerges as a mass movement during a period of sharply rising affluence, African-American community becoming wealthier, becoming more secure in their employment, a lot of manufacturing jobs. This is in a good period, not a bad period. And its leaders were the elites. The preacher class is the educated class. Now here's a great Quaker you all might recognize. Okay, here's a Quaker you might recognize. Of course, he's going to say something really right-wing about the environment, right? He's going to talk about how much he hates the environment. He says, "Shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, our land, and our water?" Even Richard Nixon is a radical environmentalist in 1970, so something's going on in the society, in the culture. There's a sense of optimism, a sense of security. Of course, in a few years we'll see a set of those things start to change, but environmentalism obviously emerging out of a period of great prosperity. So let's fast forward a bit. We've now got a set of new challenges. The first is that the world is going to consume a lot more energy between now and 2050. It's going to double or maybe triple the amount of energy it uses as 6.5 billion people go to 9 billion people, and as those 9 billion people increasingly live modern, decent lives, maybe not as nice, great of lives as we live, but increasingly modern lives, living a long time. You'll see global GDP going way up. And by the end of the century, you'll see right now the developing world having about a third of total global GDP. It will have 3/4 of global GDP by the end of the century. Of course, by that point, it won't be the developing world anymore. It'll just be part of the developed world. Of course, there's only 1.5 billion people here, and this will be 9 billion or maybe 12 billion, depending on which demographer you believe. And for the most part, this is good, not bad. Rising energy consumption leads to longer lives, better health, lesser disease, greater freedom. You have greater possibilities. You have more choices in the kind of work you do. You're less likely to do back-breaking agricultural labor. You'll do some back-breaking factory labor, and then you'll do service economy labor. You'll have greater freedom in terms of who you want to marry, who you want to love. Many, many good things here. And you see huge progress has already occurred in the number of people who are living on just $2 a day declined from 4 billion in 1982 to 2 billion today. More than 500 million Chinese have been raised out of dire poverty in less than 20 years, leaving behind dictatorial fathers, foot binding, oppressive, back-breaking agricultural labor, moving to the cities. One of the campaigns we worked on about 14 years ago was to improve the wages for Nike workers. And we did that knowing that actually when you talk to the Nike workers in China, they were much happier than they were on the farm. They did not want to go back to the farm. A lot of the young women who were interviewed said, I have a dress here, I have a couple pairs of shoes, I can wear makeup, I can go out at night. We have to work very long hours, but I had to work very long hours back on the farm, and incredible amounts of freedom. And here's the rub. Coal energy is the cheapest energy for the fastest development, and that's why the world is burning more and more of it, and there's no sign of that stopping anytime soon. So there's obviously a set of problems that this creates, and they create different problems depending on where you live. In North America, we'll have decreased snowpack, worse competition for water, especially in the West. You're going to have increased you might actually have some increases in agricultural yields, but also greater variability. In other words, some years will be bad droughts, some years you might get boom crops. You'll have longer and more intense heat waves, which will mean more people, especially the frail, dying in cities. You'll have coastal communities and wetlands stressed, all of which is pretty bad, but in fact, as these things go, things will be much worse in Africa. Africa, this is obviously not a picture from the future, this is a picture of Africa in the worst parts of today. Increased water stress, decreased agricultural yields up to 50%, sea level rise by 2100, increase in arid and semi-arid lands. All of this is just from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So you see very disproportionate effects. And the challenge, of course, is that the same people who will have the worst effects of global warming in poor countries like Africa also stand to gain the most from cheap energy sources like coal. Now, the way that my fellow liberals have dealt with this, they say, well, if the United States leads, then India and China will follow. But China has been pretty consistent in saying you can't tell people who are struggling to earn enough to eat that they need to reduce their emissions, and that's why there will be no United Nations global warming treaty. And you can see here what's going on in China just dwarfs everything going on in the West. When we make this presentation in places like Canada, we say, you know what? Your total emissions are almost irrelevant at a global level. I mean, your total emissions in Canada are less than the increase of emissions in 2009 in China. The only thing that matters in what you do is to actually make clean energy a lot cheaper through technology innovation so that poor countries like China might start to adopt those technologies. And in fact, so that rich countries like Canada will adopt them because they are still very fossil fuel dependent. So the solution here we want to argue is we need technology. Fossil fuels are energy dense, abundant, and cheap. The alternatives are expensive and difficult to scale. If you're rich, you might be able to afford a $20,000 solar system on your roof, but most of the world can't afford that. The reluctance of governments to hurt their economies is the reason why we don't have a global climate treaty like Kyoto. It's the reason why cap-and-trade was killed mostly by the Midwestern and Southern delegations in the United States. And in fact, the way we'll solve global warming will be the same way we solve past pollution problems, is that we'll create the technologies, the alternative technologies, and then we will scale them up. And the way that we can do that is actually, this is the good news, this is what America does really well, from when we were founded by Benjamin Franklin and other inventors, to what we've done with aerospace, what the US military has done with microchips and computers and the internet. We're one of the most technologically advanced civilizations, and it's because this is a culture of inventiveness. So there's a very special contribution we have to make. Now, a lot of people ask, well, can't we all just do with a little bit less? You know, maybe we all just cut back a little bit and reduce our consumption. So I wanted to just do the math here. What if we all reduced our per capita income to $15,000 a year? The per capita family income in the United States is $65,000. So let's say every American said, yeah, I'll make $50,000 less a year. Not going to happen, but let's just pretend for a minute. Here's the population growth we're going to see between 2010, 2030, and 2050. Here's freezing, as I promised we would do, the per capita GDP at 15,000 per person. And here's what the GDP would then rise to. Now let's look at the emissions. The bottom line here is you still have to cut emissions pretty drastically. So I won't bother explaining because I think I'm running out of time, the carbon intensity and energy intensity slides, but here you can see that even if, this is the one to pay attention to, even if everybody was only making $15,000 a year in 2030, you still have to cut emissions to 1/4 of that level. So that would mean either everybody reducing their income by another 3/4, or it means you need to have technologies that can replace fossil fuels. So just to give you a sense of the scale, here's what 2005 global emissions were. If you want to keep global warming within 2 degrees centigrade or less, you have to cut emissions in half by 2050, and then you basically have to cut emissions 100% by the end of the century. This little line, that's what you get if every American installs 5 compact fluorescent light bulbs, almost nothing. Here's what you get if every human being plants 10 trees, also almost nothing. Here's what you get if every car in the United States is a Prius. You can see the line at least, right? Here's what you get if you replace every coal plant in India. You can get a little bit bigger impact there. Replace every US coal plant a bit more. Replace every coal plant in China, and you still have quite a bit to go. And that's just to get to 2050. Let's look at it in a different way. This is, in 2007, energy experts with the International Energy Agency described what it would take to reduce emissions 50% by 2050. This is actually their presentation. This is what you would actually have to do. This is like the technologies you'd have to deploy. They said start with 30 new nuclear power plants around the world, add 17,000 wind turbines, add 400 biomass power plants, add 2 dams the size of China's Three Gorges Dam, which is, I think, 4 times the size of the Hoover Dam. And it took, I think, 20 years or maybe 40 years to build. You would need 42 coal or natural gas power plants that capture their carbon and store it underground. None of these plants actually exist yet, and you would need to do that every year between 2013 and 2030. So what could governments do? And I think it kind of goes without saying, that's not going to happen. No one's going to do this. So you have to have better technologies, new technologies. So what is the role of governments here? Well, the first role is to create new platforms for the new technologies. This is what governments do, and it's what the governments do really well. Governments have created the railroads, the telegraphs, the sewage systems, highways, the internet, the electrical grid. The military has purchased cutting-edge technologies for military reasons, but always identified as dual use, bringing us radios, microchips, jet turbines, GPS, lasers, solar panels, nuclear reactors. The military is very good at this. Whatever else you think about the military, very good at procurement. The government's also very good at R&D. For a variety of reasons, a lot of private companies don't want to invest in R&D because they're worried that their ideas will be stolen by another company. So the role of governments is to invest in R&D. And I've put up a picture here of the gentleman who created the predecessor to the internet known as ARPANET, which was actually a system developed to communicate during nuclear wars, obviously to great economic value worldwide. Government invests in demonstrating early technologies like wind turbines and solar panels. And you can see, if you actually look at the countries that have actually done something significant on energy, the government has directly invested in these new technologies. France built a bunch of nuclear power plants, and their emissions dropped enormously, really at a level that's unprecedented. Sweden did the same thing with dams and nuclear power. These are the only 2 countries that have reduced their emissions at the speed and the scale fast enough to keep our emissions in